Today I want to lay out the structure that I've used to help several players from Diamond all the way to Challenger improve at the game. Hopefully it helps you guys too. At the same time, I want to do some defining of different games inside of League that you play while you're playing the game. The fundamentals of the game, and a concept that many people may not be super familiar with, so hang out. It's going to be a long one. League, in my mind, is broken down into 4 different games. Before we get there, I think it's worth probably touching on something that comes up even before all of that, and that's setup. So setup is generally personal, but when I say setup, I'm referring to things like in-game settings, distance sitting from the monitor, size of the window you play in, graphical settings, all that kind of stuff. There's already like a lot of resources on this, so that's probably not worth mulling over in a ton of detail. Maybe I'll make a video just for that though. So we have a goal, and it's improving, right? You know, I want to sort of define the reasoning of the structure that I have and explain a couple of the nuances that I have inside of it, because without it, it's kind of convoluted, it seems. You can imagine League like a math problem. I use analogies a lot, so bear with me. In which, in order to master the more complicated concepts like trig and calc and stuff like that, you want to first master the basics. You know, so the same kind of way, like in school, you learn algebra, then geometry, then calc, then trig, whatever, or whatever order you learned it in. But unfortunately for League, the games inside each other aren't like fully understood, even close to the amount that these schools of math are. We'll get there someday, though. Even at the highest level, they're not. So with that, first I want to start the first game, right? And it's the first thing every League player needs to start with. It's your champ. When I refer to the player's champ, I'm referring to like the comfortability level that a player has with whatever champ they're playing. The reason that you need to be comfortable with your champ is that piloting the champ needs to be so easy for you that you can spend your time while playing your champion focused on the second, third, and fourth game. Everything else, essentially. And if you're following, you'll know that you have to be comfortable with the second game, third game, to move on to the third, fourth, blah, 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 blah. But I think we're probably getting a little ahead of ourselves. So how do we get proficient with our champions enough that we can then focus on the subsequent games? Well, there's a few things that you can do. First, I mean, I'm sure you guys have all heard this before, but I recommend choosing the smallest number of champions when you first start. The reason being is that if our goal is completely comfortable with the champ, then we need to spend most of the most time we can with that particular champion in order to spend the smallest amount of time being on like this sort of stage, right? Like we want to get past this as fast as humanly possible, right? Because it's about, you know, this is about learning efficiency. Second, I recommend choosing a simple champ. So a champ that doesn't require much like mechanical prowess or like that many games to get to that comfortability level, right? Because there's some champs like Gangplank, for example, that are going to take a lot more games to get completely comfortable with, right? So champs like Annie, Malphite, Garen, anything like that. If you guys have, if anybody is watching that's played basketball, imagine it like you're trying to learn how to play basketball, but you can't dribble without looking at the ball. You need to get to a point to where you can dribble and not have to look at the ball in order to then focus on other things. You can focus on other things without being able to dribble without looking at the ball, but it's going to be a lot harder, and it's going to pigeonhole you like crazy. Shitty thing about League is that everybody has the ball at the same time, in a kind of way. So, now, we're comfortable with our champ to the point that we don't have to spend as much like cognitive real estate on that champ. So now it's time for the meat and potatoes of the game, the fundamentals. So the fundamentals of the game are pretty much just the core concepts that apply to every game and every champion, just like any other sport or any other game. Masters of these fundamentals are going to have like a super easy time transitioning between champions and adapting to patches, because all the baseline knowledge that they have is applicable to everything, right? So what are the fundamentals of the game? This is like kind of like minorly discussed in some areas, but I don't know if it's like there's like a consensus. But I don't think it's talked that much about in general. So for this example, we'll go through each fundamental and define them, like we were saying earlier. You can think of the fundamentals like as these umbrella schools of thought, I guess you could say, that you can focus on that have like a lot of concepts beneath them. I recommend, in order to learn these, I really want you to pick one fundamental at a time and learning it to it's near completion. Like, you don't have to be Magnus Carlsen at it or anything, but just enough to where you're comfortable to move on to the next. The order that you do this in, right, because there's a list, maybe is probably going to be influenced by your own personal shortcomings. So like stuff that you're maybe not as good at, that are holding you back more than others. So first, I want to introduce a fundamental that everyone is like super familiar with, even if you're aware of it or not. So fighting, right? We'll pull this out. So fighting. Fighting, like all other fundamentals, takes a bunch of different things into account, but the main themes are going to be things like damage numbers, cooldowns, stats, armor, MR, all these types of things, right? Damage foresight's a big one, though. The next fundamental that you'll have to learn is going to be, and like I said, this is only, the order is completely personal, right? The next fundamental that I would like to talk about is space. So space, all it refers to really is the geographical spots on the map and how they influence the rest of the environment and the champions that are in it, right? A core concept under the fundamental is that the area that your champion can affect in the radius around them is really, really important to understand. Mastering that will let you do things like autospace, harass in lane, avoid harassment, positioning in fights, positioning places on the map. You don't even have to be in a fight. So space is extremely important in understanding the areas that champions can and cannot affect. The third one, well, it's kind of like 2 in 1, but mouse and camera accuracy or movement. So this is pretty self-explanatory. It refers basically just to the accuracy and the speed that your camera and mouse move at. It'll let you do things like improve your movement, skill shot accuracy, information collection, customization in how you play. Because basically, the more inputs that you have, the more inputs that your mouse has, the more custom your movements can become, right? Because the smaller they are, the more finite they are. Okay, next I want to talk about vision. So vision is pretty self-explanatory, and this is a concept that I'm particularly pretty interested in, and it's a little bit nuanced more than a lot of people think. I'm assuming, and I'll probably do a separate video on it because it's pretty cool stuff. But all it is the areas in the map that you're able to visibly see and gather information, whether it be like through direct or deductive reasoning, right? So you don't have to see somebody to gain information. Is kind of the shtick there, in layman's terms. Okay, so next I want to talk about items and runes. So things that affect your stats in the game. It obviously has to do with how they influence the game. Really important concepts to learn under this fundamental are going to be stuff like power spikes, power curves relative to items. You hear people complaining about 80 items, and that's a big reason, or marksman items, I should say. And why you pick, just understanding the core reasons that why you pick certain items and rooms for what situations. This next one is a biggie, I think, and it's probably the most underrated and most misunderstood fundamental in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong, but economy. Probably my favorite fundamental, little think piece thing after vision. All it is it refers to the resources that a team has at their disposal, whether it's gold or XP or economy of time. Sometimes people incorrectly refer to it as tempo, but that's a really stupid term. I'm really interested in this fundamental, and if anyone has cool ideas on it, I'd really love to talk about them and hear them and discuss them. Mastering this fundamental so far, like in the game's public level of understanding, comes down to mostly stuff like minion wave manipulation and fighting relative to XP levels, but I think that this can be greatly expanded upon. Inside of the different games that League has, I think that as you go up the rungs of the ladder, the game becomes more and more misunderstood, right? Because obviously it's such a new game. I think this is probably the frontier of the second game, so the fundamentals. And we'll probably see a lot of expansion on this. I mean, I hope we see a lot of expansion on this soon. The last one is draft. So, in my mind, draft is its own fundamental because it's almost like another game, right? It's a little bit contentious. I totally get it, but when I say draft, I'm more referring to the different themes that champions find themselves in, not just the actual draft part, but how the different themes of champions influence each other, like on a more general level, and how they work together and they work against each other. This is the kind of stuff that you hear when like LS and Nemi are fucking crying about Olaf Victor being on the same team. I'm actually also making a draft fundamental guide pretty soon, so be on the lookout for that. All right. So at this point, we've picked our champion, and we've also mastered every fundamental of the game, which I don't think any player actually has done yet in completion, right? And I don't even know if we're gonna ever get to a point where we can even say that it can be, but who knows? Maybe someday. Yeah, definitely let me know if you find a person that has completely mastered all the fundamentals of the game, because I'm looking. Fundamentals in my mind are probably, I mean, obviously it's just guesswork, but I'm assuming that at the highest levels, it's probably somewhere around 75% that all these things are completely understood. So it's going to take some time, I think. But that's just it's kind of an arbitrary number. So now we move on to the third game. Inside of League, which is kind of like two mini games shoved into one. You can think about it like. Although it's a lot easier to explain it now that we've sort of defined the first two games being your champion and the fundamentals. All the third game refers to really is being so comfortable with your game that you can spend your cognitive real estate, like the time that you have to think, focusing on basically the first and second games of the enemy champ that you're playing against, or the enemy team. Players that do this, players already do this. Like even bad players do this. But I think at the highest levels of play, the people that do this the most efficiently are able to demonstrate themselves as an exception, right? Like it turns like good players into exceptional players if you can do this really well. This is because it's sort of the frontier of League of Legends theory and thought in my mind, and it manifests itself in some extremely complicated situations, but also some really simple situations, right? Like buying Void Staff when you have 3 EP champs on your team, or something like that. Because you're assuming that enemies are going to buy MR or whatever. Like, but there's a lot more complicated examples. But that's some really cool stuff to see in game when you're watching a player like Faker, Chovy, Showmaker, all these guys, and they're sort of assuming what the other person is going to do, assuming that they play right. And that kind of brings us into our fourth game, which I think is the really fun part. And I'm not going to worry so much about improving here, because this is more the for fun area. But in my mind, the fourth game is the psychological part of the game. And the reason I think it's a little bit for fun is because it's so misunderstood in my mind, or at least by me, that it's really hard for me to imagine that this is like super concrete. Because if game 1 is understood at a reasonable level, and then game 2 is like 70, and let's say game 3 is like 50 to 40, this is like 20 or like 10%, right? Like I can't imagine anybody is like extremely adept at this. I don't think the game's old enough. This is places where like mutually available information comes out. I'll provide an example. Let's say that you're Chovy and you're landing against Faker, right? You're both good players, right? And you know you're both good players. You're in a favorable matchup as Chovy, but Faker is playing really, really, really aggressive at this point. When you know he shouldn't be. You know this. You know also that Faker knows that he shouldn't be playing aggressively, right? Now it gets tough. Now you have two conclusions that you can draw from this. Oh, thanks, Tatsu. You have two things that you can draw from this, right? One, is he manipulating me to think that his jungler is around so that his jungler can accomplish something else on some other part of the map? Or is he baiting me with the knowledge that he knows that I have, right? Because Faker at this point knows that he's in a losing matchup with the knowledge that he knows that I have, right? So we're both understanding the same exact thing, right? So it gets really convoluted. Because Faker at this point knows that he's in a losing matchup, and he knows Chovy knows that he's in a losing matchup, it becomes really difficult because is Faker bluffing or not? And this is where the psychological stuff comes into play. And then you can do things like developing artificial patterns. So you influence your enemy laner to pick up on certain patterns that you create. That's why they're artificial. And then you flip the script and get an advantage in some way. So basically the question comes down to how much do we expect our enemy team to understand? Like to what mental level do they go? Like how deep do you go, right? So this eventually devolves into the question, into this infinite cycle of repeating conclusions, similar to like Nash's theory, if you guys are like into game theory. But the fourth game is like more of a think piece, and I don't know if it's like so much worrying about because the second and third game are just not understood enough, in my opinion. Although like I'm super like interested in having like more conversations about this kind of thing, so that'd be pretty cool. But I mean that's really all it is. To wrap it up, as you're traveling down like your path of improvement of the game, it's really important to be aware what's ahead of you, but making sure that you take the one step at a time in order not to get ahead of yourself. Right? You can learn things and use things from the deeper games in League, but in order to really move on, in order to really improve, you have to master them in chronological order. You're going to be pigeonholed really hard. Pigeonholed really, really hard. But thanks for listening to me drivel on for 20 minutes. I'll